What's up, folks? Today on our quick tutorial, we're going to be talking to you about shutter speed, what it is, and how to use it to get sick shots. So what is shutter speed? Basically, shutter speed is how long your physical shutter stays open, exposing your camera sensor to light after you press the shutter button. Usually, your shutter speed is expressed as a fraction, so 1/60, 1/100, 1/1000, and anywhere in between. What that's essentially representing is a fraction of a second. So if the shutter speed reads 160, that shutter speed is 1/60th of a second, meaning that the shutter is staying open for 1/60th of a second before closing. Now 1/100 is 1/100th of a second. 1/1000 is 1/1000th of a second. So as you can imagine, 1/60th of a second is a much slower shutter speed than 1/1000th or 1/2000th of a second. A lot of times you can even hear the difference in shutter speed when taking a picture. For example, here is a shutter speed that is 1/4 of a second, and this is a shutter speed at 1/1000th of a second. So why does this matter? Well, it matters for a couple of reasons. The first is exposure. Shutter speed is part of the exposure triangle that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and basically helps regulate how much light is actually getting to your sensor. The faster your shutter speed is, the less light is going to get to your sensor. The slower your shutter speed is, the more light that's going to get to your sensor. The second reason shutter speed matters is because it impacts how much motion blur is in a photograph. Now, the general rule in stills photography for shutter speed is that if you want to shoot a still subject handheld and have no motion blur, you want your shutter speed to be twice your focal length. So if you're shooting at 200 millimeters, you're going to want to shoot a shutter speed of 1/400. Now, this doesn't really apply to video. Generally, when shooting video, you want your shutter speed to be twice your frame rate, and we really don't mess around with that too much unless we really have to increase or decrease our exposure. So in terms of motion blur, shutter speed works like this. The slower your shutter speed, the more motion blur you're going to have in a shot. The higher your shutter speed, the less motion blur you're going to have. So you want to keep that in mind when you're shooting things. If you're shooting a still subject and your camera is locked off on a tripod, you probably don't need that high of a shutter speed. But if you're shooting a moving subject or you're hand holding your camera, you may want a higher shutter speed. Now you can start messing around with shutter speed and get some really cool and interesting results. Here's a couple of examples for you. In this first picture, you've got a shutter speed of 1/5 of a second, which means it's open pretty long. This was probably shot on a tripod, and you can tell by all these streaks of light that the shutter has been open for a really long time, and you get that really silky smooth motion blur. Now the next picture has a little bit of a faster shutter speed, but not by much. It's 1/15th of a second. You still have a little bit of that motion blur, but you can see that things are starting to get a little bit sharper. Now this third picture is just kind of a representation of an average shutter speed. This one was shot at 1/160th of a second. This walking shot was shot at 1/320th of a second. Now I increased the shutter speed on this one because I was walking with the camera, as were the subjects, and I wanted to make sure that I froze it all in motion. This picture right here has a 1/800th of a second exposure. You can see our subject here is pouring coffee into a pour over rig, and I really wanted to freeze the motion of that coffee coming out of the cap, so I cranked up the shutter speed to make sure that I could freeze that. Now the picture with the highest shutter speed out of this sequence is this one. This is shot at 1/2000th of a second. We chose that because this is a super fast subject moving really quickly, and in order to freeze that in motion, you really have to use a fast shutter speed. Now, long exposure photography is really a whole other discipline, but I included it here because it relates to shutter speed in the way that it's basically a picture taken with the shutter open for 5, 10, 15, 30, or sometimes even more seconds. Basically what that does is it allows the sensor to just capture so much light that you can really get some super cool pictures. One of the main uses for long exposure photography, at least in our book, is going to be those night pictures, those star lapses and Milky Way shots. And basically by having the camera shutter open for 20 seconds, as is the case with this picture here, you really can capture all of that light and get a super cool picture that sometimes shows more detail than your eyes can even pick up. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. If it was, drop us a like, leave a comment, and we'll keep doing these. Get out there, shoot your cameras, show us what you got. Peace.